John Gruelle was an artist and writer. On September 7, 1915, he got a special paper called a patent. This patent wasn't for a big machine or a major invention. It was for a simple, cute doll. The idea for this doll came many years earlier. His daughter Marcella found an old, plain rag doll in their attic. The doll didn't have a face. Even though it was simple, Marcella used her imagination with it. She brought the doll to her father, maybe because she thought he could make it better with his creative skills. John, a man whose mind danced with whimsy and wonder, took the doll from her small hands. He turned it over, his artist's eye appraising its blank canvas. "I think it's missing something," he mused, a smile playing on his lips. With a few deft strokes of his pen, he drew two bright, inquisitive button eyes and a sweet, triangular nose, instantly imbuing the doll with a personality. He handed it back to Marcella, who beamed with delight. Little did John Gruelle comprehend the monumental journey this simple act of fatherly affection would embark upon. This impromptu facial artistry was the genesis of Raggedy Ann, a character that would first leap from the pages of his enchanting children's stories, and then, with that 1915 patent, into the arms of millions, becoming one of the most cherished and iconic toys of the 20th century. Raggedy Ann, with her yarn hair and perpetual smile, symbolized innocence, comfort, and the enduring magic of childhood. However, the river of time has a curious way of twisting narratives, of imbuing the innocent with an altogether darker aura. 45 years after Raggedy Ann's official birth, in 1970, the purchase of an old, well-loved Raggedy Ann doll from the dusty shelves of an antique store would set in motion a chain of events far removed from idyllic playrooms. This particular doll, bearing the familiar visage, would become the unwilling protagonist in one of the most chilling and widely disseminated ghost stories of modern times. Its tale would become inextricably linked with Ed and Lorraine Warren, two of the most prominent and indeed controversial figures in the realm of paranormal investigation. It would inspire a multi-million-dollar horror film franchise that would terrify audiences nearly a century after Raggedy Ann's conception. And, most disturbingly, it would be whispered to have played a role in a tragic, real-life death. So, find a comfortable chair, perhaps lower the lights, and allow the familiar click and whir to transport you as we hit play on the first tape in our spectral library. This is the alleged true story of the world's most infamous demonic doll. This is the story of Annabelle. Deirdre Bernard, a vibrant 25-year-old on the cusp of completing her nursing studies, must have felt a wave of bemusement wash over her as she unwrapped her birthday present from her mother. Inside the cheerful paper lay not a piece of jewelry, a useful household item, or a book related to her studies, but an old, child-sized Raggedy Ann doll. It was undeniably large, almost unnervingly so for a decorative item. Deirdre wasn't a doll collector, nor had she expressed any recent nostalgic pining for childhood toys. The logic behind her mother's choice was, and remains, somewhat opaque. When later asked about the peculiar gift, Deirdre could only offer, "It was just something novel, a decoration." Perhaps it was an impulse buy, a whimsical notion that struck her mother as she browsed the antique shop, imagining it would add a touch of vintage charm to her daughter's student lodgings. Yet, with the chilling hindsight of what was to unfold, one might be tempted to speculate further. Did something about this specific doll call out to Deirdre's mother? Did an unseen influence guide her hand, subtly manipulating circumstances to ensure this particular Raggedy Ann found its way into Deirdre's life? Such thoughts, while speculative, add a layer of unease to an otherwise ordinary transaction. Regardless of the impetus, the doll soon took up residence in the modest student apartment Deirdre shared with Lara Clifton, another young nursing student. Deirdre, perhaps out of a sense of obligation, or a genuine, if fleeting, appreciation for its quaintness, found a place for it. Each morning, after meticulously making her bed, she would position the large Raggedy Ann doll at its head, sitting upright, its yarn arms resting stiffly at its sides, its fabric legs stretched out before it, like a silent, watchful sentinel. The strange occurrences surrounding Deirdre's new acquisition began insidiously, as such unsettling phenomena often do. For several weeks, life in the apartment continued its normal rhythm. The doll was just a doll, a static piece of decor. But then, Deirdre began to notice subtle incongruities. She was a creature of habit, particularly with the arrangement of her room. She distinctly remembered placing the doll in that precise pose each day, arms at its side, legs straight. Yet, upon returning from her demanding nursing shifts or classes in the evening, the doll would be different. Not dramatically so at first. One evening, its fabric ankles might be crossed. The next, she'd find its arms folded primly in its lap. Initially, Deirdre's logical mind sought a rational explanation. Lara, her roommate, or perhaps Lara's fiancé, Cal, who was a frequent visitor, must be playing a prank. It was the sort of gentle teasing one might expect in a shared living situation. So, after a few weeks of these minor, yet persistent, irregularities, Deirdre decided to conduct a quiet experiment. She began to vary the doll's morning pose deliberately. One day she might cross its legs herself, or position an arm differently. Each evening, without fail, the doll would be in a subtly altered state, never quite as she had left it, but also never in a way that overtly screamed of interference. The game, if it was one, continued for a while longer, before Deirdre finally confronted Lara. "Have you been moving my doll?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Lara, however, met her query with a look of genuine surprise, and pleaded complete ignorance, assuring Deirdre she hadn't touched it. Cal, too, denied any involvement, looking more perplexed than mischievous. The unsettling incidents soon escalated beyond mere repositioning. One evening, Deirdre and Lara returned to the apartment together. As they pushed open their front door, they both stopped dead in their tracks. There, in the middle of the living room floor, directly in their path, was the Raggedy Ann doll. It wasn't just lying there, it was kneeling. Kneeling, as if in supplication or prayer. The doll, being soft and stuffed with yielding material, was not designed to be posable in such a manner. It had no internal armature, no joints that could lock into place. Despite repeated, almost frantic attempts by both Deirdre and Lara to replicate the kneeling pose, the doll would simply slump and fall over, its floppy limbs refusing to support its weight in that position. The sight was deeply unnerving, a clear signal that whatever was happening was beyond a simple prank. This was the turning point, the moment when unease began to curdle into genuine fear. Soon after the kneeling incident, Lara and Deirdre started discovering notes around the apartment. These weren't typed or neatly written. They were scrawled in a messy, childlike cursive on small scraps of parchment paper. The messages themselves were cryptic and unsettling. "Help us," one read. Another pleaded, "Help Cal." The mention of Lara's fiancé was particularly disturbing, though Cal was, by all outward appearances, never in any discernible danger when these notes materialized. What amplified the eeriness was the material itself. The girls were adamant. There were no pencils of that type, nor any parchment paper kept anywhere in their apartment. Someone, or something, was not only writing these messages, but also seemingly bringing the very materials into their home from an unknown source. Convinced now that an intruder must be responsible, despite the increasingly bizarre nature of the events, the young women took practical measures. They began to set subtle traps, a specific arrangement of items near doors that would be disturbed, fine threads across windowsills, rugs positioned just so. They meticulously checked locks and latches, anything they could think of to detect an unauthorized entry. But their efforts yielded nothing. No marks were ever disturbed, no threads broken. There was absolutely no evidence of any physical intruder. The phenomena grew more overtly sinister. One evening, returning to the apartment, Deirdre found the doll on her bed in its usual spot. But this time, there was something horrifyingly new. Streaks and droplets of a reddish substance, which looked alarmingly like blood, were smeared on the doll's fabric hand and dotted across its chest. Panic flared. The girls, their hearts pounding, searched the apartment frantically for any source of the blood. A cut finger, a nosebleed, anything. They found nothing. The origin of the blood remained a terrifying mystery. After 6 weeks of escalating strangeness, from subtle movements to impossible poses, cryptic notes, and now apparent bloodstains, Deirdre and Lara were at their wits' end. The rational explanations they had clung to were crumbling. They felt isolated, unsure who to turn to. A doctor, the police. What would they say? Our doll is moving and writing notes. They feared, quite rightly, that they would be dismissed as hysterical or delusional. It was this sense of desperation that led them to consider a path they might never have otherwise entertained, consulting a medium. If the cause wasn't physical, perhaps the answer lay in the spiritual realm. Lara and Deirdre managed to find a local medium, a woman who agreed to visit their apartment and conduct a séance. Neither of the young nursing students were particularly inclined towards the occult, but they were exhausted, frightened, and desperate for answers. Something was undeniably happening with that Raggedy Ann doll, something that defied all logical explanation. What they were about to discover during that séance, however, would be more startling and, in its own way, more manipulative than they could have ever anticipated. The medium arrived, and in the dim light of their student apartment, the séance began. According to the account, contact was indeed made. The spirit the medium relayed was that of a young girl named Annabelle Higgins. Annabelle, the medium explained, had died tragically at the tender age of 7. The very ground upon which their modern apartment complex now stood had once been fields where young Annabelle used to play, decades before. Her spirit, the medium continued, had remained tethered to this location. While previous tenants had been adults, in whom Annabelle had little interest, she had felt a connection to Deirdre and Lara. These young, caring nursing students, she sensed, would understand her loneliness and her desire for companionship. Annabelle, speaking through the medium, confessed that she was the one moving the doll. It was her way of trying to get their attention, to play with them, to make friends. All she wanted, she conveyed with a childlike pathos, was to be loved and looked after. Affection she claimed she had been denied in her short, sad life. Then came the pivotal request. Annabelle asked if Deirdre and Lara would allow her spirit to move into the Raggedy Ann doll. This way, she could always be with them, a constant companion. Caught in the emotional atmosphere of the séance, swayed by the tragic tale of a lonely child spirit, and perhaps relieved to finally have an explanation, however outlandish, for the unsettling events, the girls made a fateful decision. They said yes. It was a compassionate response, born of youthful empathy, but one they would soon come to regret profoundly. It wasn't just a doll anymore. "It was Annabelle," Deirdre stated in a later interview, her voice tinged with a mixture of past naivety and lingering disquiet. Following the séance, the girls began to treat the doll not as an inanimate object, but as the vessel for the spirit of a little girl. They spoke to Annabelle daily, included her in their simple games, and even bought the doll small pieces of jewelry, adorning it as one might a cherished child. Looking back on it now, maybe we shouldn't have given the doll so much credence, Deirdre admitted. But really, we saw the thing as being no more than a harmless mascot. It never hurt anything. At least not until the other day. The insidious thought that the spirit entity they had communicated with might not have been the innocent child it claimed to be never crossed their minds. Lara's fiancé, Cal, however, remained deeply skeptical and unnerved by the entire situation. He had disliked the doll from the moment he first saw it, finding its blank stare and oversized form unsettling. The girl's decision to invite a spirit into it only amplified his discomfort. "The thing's got a mind, and dolls don't have minds, right?" he reportedly said. "So from the beginning, I didn't think this thing moving around the apartment was cute." His aversion wasn't just a passing fancy. It manifested in a more disturbing way. "The thing gives me bad dreams, recurrent ones, but what I'm going to tell you is not a dream as far as I am concerned." Cal was plagued by nightmares featuring the Raggedy Ann doll almost from its arrival. Initially, they were just unsettling, but one night, sleeping in his own apartment, Cal experienced something far more terrifying. He described falling into an unusually deep sleep, then becoming aware, as if watching events unfold through his own eyes, while simultaneously observing himself from an outside perspective. In this state, Cal's eyes snapped open. His room was dark, but an immediate, palpable sense of dread washed over him. He scanned the room, his gaze darting through the shadows. Nothing seemed out of place until he looked towards the foot of his bed. There, illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through his window, was Annabelle. The doll wasn't just lying there. It was, he claimed, slowly, silently gliding up the length of his body. It reached his chest. Paralyzed by an overwhelming fear, Cal could only watch in horror as the doll's stitched yarn arms moved, positioning themselves on either side of his neck. Then, Annabelle began to strangle him. He fought, desperate to throw the doll off, to break free, but it felt immensely strong, unmovable. He struggled for what felt like an eternity, gasping for air, until he finally jolted awake, drenched in sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The dream, if it was a dream, felt terrifyingly, viscerally real, while Cal's nocturnal experience bears the hallmarks of sleep paralysis, a phenomenon where the mind wakes while the body remains temporarily immobilized, often accompanied by vivid and frightening hallucinations. What happened next cannot be so easily categorized. One early evening, Cal, thoroughly frustrated with the entire bizarre situation and the girl's increasing attachment to the doll, lost his temper. In a fit of exasperation, he grabbed the Annabelle doll from a chair in the lounge, marched to Deirdre's room, and unceremoniously threw it onto the floor, slamming her door shut afterwards. Later that night, Deirdre was out, leaving Lara and Cal alone in the apartment. They were sitting in the living room, perhaps trying to enjoy a moment of normalcy, when a series of loud, unsettling noises erupted from Deirdre's closed bedroom. It sounded like something heavy was being dragged or thrown about. Worried that an intruder had somehow managed to get in, Cal, despite his fear, felt compelled to investigate. The noises continued, a cacophony of thumps and scrapes as he cautiously crept towards Deirdre's door. Then, just as he reached it, the sounds abruptly stopped, plunging the apartment into an eerie silence. Taking a deep breath, Cal slowly turned the doorknob and pushed the door open, simultaneously flicking on the light switch. The room appeared undisturbed. Clothes were where they should be, books neatly stacked. The Raggedy Ann doll lay on the floor, exactly where he had angrily flung it hours earlier. Nothing seemed out of place. Reassured yet still on edge, Cal stepped further into the room, his eyes warily scanning the corners. As he slowly approached the discarded doll, he felt an overwhelming sensation, a chilling awareness he later described as a presence, an invisible, malevolent entity very close by. Instinctively, Cal spun around, expecting to confront someone or something. There was nothing. The room was empty. Suddenly, Lara, still in the living room, heard Cal cry out, a raw scream of pain and terror. He staggered back out of Deirdre's room, clutching his chest, his face pale and contorted. He doubled over, gasping. Lara rushed to his side. With trembling fingers, Cal unbuttoned his shirt. There, emblazoned across his chest, were 7 distinct angry red welts that quickly began to bleed. 3 drawn vertically, 4 horizontally, as if something with sharp claws had violently raked him in a frenzied rage. Cal described the sensation as an intense, burning pain. Remarkably, despite the initial bleeding and the vividness of the marks, all traces of the wounds had reportedly vanished within 24 to 48 hours, leaving no scars. This brutal, physical attack on Cal was the terrifying catalyst that shattered any remaining illusions the girls might have held about Annabelle. The warm, comforting presence they had initially perceived, or perhaps willed themselves to perceive, from the spirit of Annabelle Higgins was gone, replaced by a palpable sense of menace. This was no longer a game, no longer a curious paranormal occurrence. This was dangerous. It was at this critical juncture that Deirdre and Lara, now thoroughly frightened, decided they needed help beyond what a medium could offer. They contacted a priest who taught at a nearby college, a man named Father Cook, often referred to as Father Kevin in some accounts. When questioned later about why they chose a priest over a doctor or the police, Deirdre's response was laced with the pragmatic despair of someone who has experienced the unbelievable. Do you think someone off the street would have believed where the claw marks on Cal's chest came from? It's a sentiment that likely resonates with many who claim paranormal experiences. The fear of ridicule often silences them, leading to the vast underreporting of such incidents. Who indeed are you supposed to turn to when the seemingly impossible invades your reality? Father Cook listened patiently and, importantly, without immediate dismissal, as Deirdre, Lara, and a still-shaken Cal recounted their harrowing tale. The trio had steeled themselves for skepticism, perhaps even gentle condescension. To their immense relief, Father Cook believed them. Or at the very least, he recognized the genuine terror in their eyes and the inexplicable nature of their claims. He told them that while he couldn't speculate on the exact nature of what was happening in their apartment, he felt the situation warranted intervention from someone with more specialized knowledge within the church. He promised to contact a higher authority, a Father Eamon Grimes, often referred to as Father Everett, a man purportedly authorized by the diocese to perform the rite of exorcism. While Father Grimes possessed the canonical knowledge required for such solemn rituals, his direct experience with the more arcane aspects of paranormal phenomena, particularly the nuanced field of demonology, was reportedly limited. Recognizing this, and perhaps sensing the unusual severity of the case, Father Grimes, in turn, reached out to a pair of investigators who had established a working relationship with certain elements of the church over a number of years. And this is how Ed and Lorraine Warren arguably the most famous and controversial paranormal investigators of the 20th century, became central figures in the unfolding drama of Annabelle. Ed Warren, a self-proclaimed demonologist, and his wife Lorraine, a purported clairvoyant and medium, had by then built a formidable reputation. They claimed to have investigated thousands of cases of alleged hauntings and demonic activity, including the infamous Amityville haunting and the Enfield poltergeist, though their involvement and interpretations in these high-profile cases remain subjects of intense debate. The Warrens were charismatic figures, captivating audiences on the lecture circuit with their chilling tales of battles against nefarious spirits and demonic entities. They were, and remain, deeply polarizing. Skeptics frequently dismissed them as con artists, exploiting the vulnerable and sensationalizing events for fame and, eventually, fortune. Yet for many years, particularly in the early stages of their career, they reportedly did not charge for their investigations, dedicating their lives to this singular, often unsettling, pursuit. If they were charlatans, as many critics vehemently asserted, they were undeniably dedicated ones. Gerald Brittle's book, The Demonologist, The Extraordinary Career of Ed and Lorraine Warren, which heavily informs many accounts of their cases, including Annabelle, paints a picture of a couple utterly convinced of the reality of their work, viewing it as a spiritual battle. The stories within its pages are as terrifying as they are, at times, difficult to believe, often colored by the Warrens' devout Catholic worldview, which framed paranormal events as manifestations of good versus evil, God versus Satan. This perspective would later inspire the Conjuring Cinematic Universe, catapulting the Warrens into household name status for a new generation long after their primary investigative years. Upon their arrival at the apartment, Ed and Lorraine Warren spent considerable time speaking with Deirdre, Lara, and Cal, listening intently before Father Grimes was due to arrive. They probed for every detail, every nuance, patiently exploring any possible rational explanations for the phenomena, however mundane. After hearing the entirety of their story, the moving doll, the notes, the blood, the seance, the story of Annabelle Higgins, and finally, the violent attack on Cal, Ed Warren, with his characteristic conviction, arrived at a chilling conclusion. The entity, Ed explained, was not the spirit of a 7-year-old girl. Human spirits, he asserted, simply do not possess the power to manifest phenomena of this intensity and malevolence. What the girls had inadvertently invited into their lives, and by extension, into the doll, was something far older and more sinister, an inhuman demonic spirit. This entity, he theorized, had cleverly manipulated them. It began by moving the doll to arouse their curiosity. Once their interest was piqued, they made the predictable mistake, as Ed termed it, of bringing in a medium. Through the medium, the entity preyed on their emotional vulnerabilities, concocting the tragic story of Annabelle Higgins to elicit sympathy and, crucially, to gain permission to inhabit the doll, or at least to be more formally welcomed into their lives. According to Ed Warren's demonological framework, such permission or invitation is a critical step, granting the entity greater purchase and influence in the physical world. It aroused fear through the weird movements of the doll, Ed is quoted as explaining to Father Grimes when he finally arrived. It brought about the materialization of disturbing handwritten notes. It left a residue of blood on the doll, and ultimately it even struck the young man. Ed was firm. There never was an Annabelle Higgins connected to this case. The doll itself was not possessed in the classic sense, but rather was being used as a conduit, a focal point for the demonic entity's activities. It was a tool to instill fear and to gain a foothold. Lorraine, using her purported clairvoyant abilities, confirmed she could sense a heavy, oppressive presence in the apartment, an almost tangible malevolence that hung in the air as they spoke. Ed even offered to provoke the suspected demon to provide Father Grimes with more direct evidence of its presence. But the priest, already visibly shaken by the accounts he had heard, politely declined. "Why don't I just do what needs to be done?" he reportedly said, eager to proceed with the spiritual cleansing. Father Grimes then performed the Episcopalian rite of blessing throughout the apartment, a ritual less formal than a full exorcism, but intended to cleanse the space of negative spiritual influences. He prayed over Deirdre, Lara, and Cal, anointing them and asking for divine protection. As the ritual concluded, Lorraine Warren stated that she could feel the oppressive spiritual weight lift from the apartment, the malevolent presence receding. Their work, it seemed, was done. The apartment felt lighter, the atmosphere less charged. But as the Warrens and Father Grimes prepared to leave, Deirdre, despite Ed's assurances that the doll itself was not possessed but merely a conduit, was terrified at the thought of it remaining. She begged the Warrens to take it with them. Ed and Lorraine maintained a private collection of artifacts from their investigations in their Connecticut home, a place that would eventually become known as the Warrens' Occult Museum. Filled with items deemed to be cursed, haunted, or used in occult practices, it was a repository of the strange and sinister. Given this, they were perhaps more amenable than most to adding the Raggedy Ann doll to their collection. They agreed. However, despite Ed's earlier pronouncement that the doll was simply an instrument, it soon appeared that something malevolent, if not intrinsic to the doll, then certainly deeply attached to it, was now on the move with them. The horrors associated with Annabelle hadn't ended with the blessing of the apartment. They had merely changed location. Placing the Raggedy Ann doll in the back seat of their car, a relatively new vehicle at the time, the Warrens began the long drive back to their home in Connecticut. It wasn't long before Lorraine became acutely aware of what she described as an overwhelming aura of vicious hatred emanating from the back seat, specifically from the doll. As they navigated dark, winding country lanes, their car began to experience inexplicable mechanical failures. At each dangerous curve, the engine would sputter and stall, causing the power steering and brakes to fail intermittently. After the third near-catastrophic incident, which almost sent them careening off the road, Ed, alarmed and convinced the doll was responsible, pulled over to the side of the road. He retrieved a vial of holy water from his bag and doused the Raggedy Ann doll thoroughly, reciting prayers. According to their account, there were no further mechanical incidents on the remainder of the journey home. Once Annabelle was installed in their house, the Warrens began to experience firsthand some of the unsettling phenomena that Deirdre and Lara had described, and then some. The doll would reportedly appear in different rooms of the house, even when left in a specific, secured location. Locked doors seemed to offer no impediment to its apparent teleportation. Ed even claimed to have witnessed the doll levitating on one occasion. A mysterious black cat began to appear frequently in Ed's office, showing an unusual fascination with his collection of occult objects, but especially with Annabelle. As quickly and silently as the cat would materialize, it would vanish again, leaving no trace. The doll also seemed to exhibit a strong, almost violent aversion to clergy. On one occasion, Lorraine reported hearing loud, guttural growls reverberating through the house. She searched for a source but found nothing. Later, they discovered that these growls, which they had managed to capture on an answer phone tape, coincided with two back-to-back calls from Father Cook, Father Kevin, who had called to check in. The tape reportedly held 3 recordings: Father Cook's first message, then the distinct growling sounds, followed by Father Cook's second message. The doll's ominous reputation grew. A police detective investigating a homicide case that had suspected links to witchcraft or satanic cult activity once met with Ed at the Warrens' home to consult on the case. Ed had to take an urgent phone call and went upstairs, telling the detective to feel free to look around his office, where Annabelle and other items were kept. Ed would later state he never found out exactly what the detective saw or experienced, but within 5 minutes, the man came rushing upstairs, his face ashen, his eyes wide with terror. He just kept repeating, "The doll, the rag doll is real. It's alive." Annabelle became a key, and perhaps the most infamous, exhibit in the Warrens' Occult Museum for decades. Countless stories circulated about the experiences of visitors who came into proximity with her. One oft-repeated tale involves a priest who visited the museum. Upon seeing Annabelle, he allegedly scoffed at the notion of a demonic doll, picked it up, or tapped on its case, accounts vary, and mockingly challenged it, saying something to the effect of, "You're just a doll, Annabelle. You can't hurt anyone." According to the Warrens, Ed warned the priest to be careful driving home. Later that day, the priest called Lorraine, deeply shaken. He had been involved in a serious, near-fatal car accident on his way back. His car was totaled, though he escaped with relatively minor injuries. He attributed the crash to looking in his rearview mirror and seeing the doll sitting in his back seat, causing him to lose control. Other accounts tell of ornaments and objects inexplicably exploding or flying off shelves in the Warrens' home when the doll was moved or particularly active. Workmen or repairmen visiting the house often reported feeling an intense sense of unease or dread when near the room where Annabelle was kept, sometimes even asking for the doll to be covered or removed before they would continue their work. The very atmosphere around Annabelle seemed to be charged with a negative energy that had a palpable impact on those sensitive to it, or perhaps on anyone who came too close. However, the most tragic and disturbing incident linked to Annabelle involved a young couple who visited the Warrens' Occult Museum, likely on one of their guided tours. The young man, apparently attempting to impress his girlfriend with his bravado, began to taunt Annabelle. He approached her specially constructed glass display case, started banging on it, and loudly goaded the doll, daring it to scratch him like it had supposedly scratched Cal years before. Ed Warren, who maintained a strict no-touching policy and expected respectful behavior around the artifacts, had already warned the young man to be careful and respectful of the items in the museum. With this blatant show of disrespect and provocation, Ed sternly asked the couple to leave. What happened next is relayed as a chilling testament to the doll's alleged malevolence. Sometime later that same day, the young woman from the couple returned to the Warrens' home. She was alone, clearly in a state of profound shock, almost in a daze. She told Ed and Lorraine a horrifying story. After leaving the museum, she and her boyfriend had been riding on his motorcycle. He had been laughing about the doll, continuing his mockery. Then, inexplicably, he lost control of the motorcycle. It swerved violently and crashed into a tree or lamppost. Details vary in retellings. The young man was killed instantly. The girl, riding as a passenger, survived, though she was deeply traumatized. It seems the blessing performed in Deirdre and Lara's apartment was successful in cleansing their living space. No further strange incidents were reported there, and the two nursing students, understandably, chose to move on with their lives, and rarely, if ever, spoke publicly about Annabelle again. Despite Ed Warren's initial assertions that the doll was merely a conduit and not intrinsically possessed, the catalogue of disturbing events that followed Annabelle to the Warrens' home and continued within their museum suggests that, if these stories are to be believed, something profoundly malevolent, whether residing in the doll or inextricably attached to it, indeed returned home with them that day. Ed and Lorraine Warren have since passed away. Ed in 2006 and Lorraine in 2019. Their son-in-law, Tony Spera, continues to oversee the collection. The Warrens' Occult Museum, for a long time housed in a section of their Monroe, Connecticut home, has been closed to the public for an extended period due to zoning regulations and is reportedly seeking a new location. Nonetheless, wherever she currently resides, Annabelle, the Raggedy Ann doll with the deceptively innocent face, remains locked within her specially constructed glass case. Beside her, a stark, hand-lettered sign serves as a chilling reminder of her dark reputation and the dire warnings associated with her. Warning: positively do not open. The simple toy that John Gruelle lovingly brought to life for his daughter has, through a bizarre and terrifying series of alleged events, transformed into a potent symbol of paranormal dread, her story forever etched into the annals of supernatural lore.